So this morning at 6:33 as we get this pre-Friday edition of the show underway. Getting ready to wrap up the week. Wrapping up the month today, we'll get the next shot at jobless claims. Now that's expected to come in. I was seeing numbers this morning, Mike, around 3 million, 3.5 million claims expected.
I believe it's 3.5.
Yeah.
But that means it could be 2 or it could be 5.
It's true. And the thing, there was an interesting study out yesterday. So the Economic Policy Institute actually did a very interesting study on jobless claims. So far we've got about 30 million people, 26, 28 million people that have filed for jobless claims. But about 2 out of every 10 that do file can't file for one reason or the other, or haven't filed. Other people are showing up and the lines are so long that they're just like, okay, I'll file next week when things slow down a little bit because they've got a little bit of money in the bank maybe or something. So that the actual number of unemployed may be closer to 50 million than 30 million, which is pretty phenomenal. It's kind of amazing when you think about it because as of the last full employment number that we have for February, there were 150 million people employed in the economy. So if you take 50 million out of that, you had a 32.8% drop in employment in a month. I mean, just really phenomenal about that. But again, the idea of jobless claims, I touched on this morning, and we were talking a little bit about, this idea of this tendency towards socialism, et cetera. One thing that we've done differently this time around is 2 things. One, they've added another $600 to the unemployment benefit claims that you get every month. And we were doing direct checks to households. So, households were getting $1,200 for their check, and this is the first time that we've seen this idea of a helicopter drop, basically money dropping out of helicopters on the households is the theory here. And it's going to be interesting to see, how that works, because this is kind of that first step towards the idea of universal basic income where everybody just gets government subsidies. And if you make $60,000 or less a year, you actually make more money now being fired. So the question is does that deter people from going back to work?
We're seeing the very beginnings of why socialism has issues. It's because the incentives to work are reduced. Mm-hmm. And I've heard this anecdotally. My brother, who we've talked about a few times, has told me this, that his employees are okay being fired because they're actually some of them are making more than they were. And I've heard it from some other friends too, that anecdotally people are making more being unemployed and sitting at home and watching Netflix than they were at work. So when these restaurants want to open and all these other places want to open, are you going to sign up to be on the front lines where you're exposing yourself to the virus, where you have to work to get paid less? Mm-hmm. Well, there's a real problem.
Yeah, well, no, and look, I've talked to several employers that weren't able to get into the PPP program, either ran out of money or they didn't qualify for some reason, whatever it was. Because that PPP program, the payroll protection program, only went to about 5% of small businesses. So, I mean, it was for the amount of business destruction that was occurring in March and April, the money that was sent to that program was not nearly enough. It was a drop in the bucket. So, many employers and I've talked to several, even here in Houston, they fired their workers even though they didn't actually need to, but they went ahead and laid off their workers because they had a choice, right? You can stay here and maybe take a pay cut, or you can get fired and make more money from the payroll benefits. So they wwent ahead and fired them so they could make more money. It was also kind of like a mercy killing, so to speak. But it was for the benefit. It was really for the benefit of the employee because they could make more money being unemployed than actually showing up to work.
Right. So a lot of people will come back, right?
Sure.
They want to earn they want to earn their money. They know that this isn't going to continue forever. But there's going to be a lot of people that are saying, no, I'm just going to sit on my tush, and we're on radio. Got to be careful. Yeah. They're going to sit on their tush and they're going to stay at home, and it's going to be hard getting them out. And even if everything opens up, I think it's this situation, this unemployment, this chronic unemployment, which we've seen. The BLS puts out what's called the participation rate. Mm-hmm. And despite the last 10 years, the participation rate, or number of people that are of working age that are actually working, has been the lowest in, 50 years, Lance? I forgot. It's been an awful recovery.
Right. Well, that's kind of the interesting conundrum that the Fed's going to potentially run into, which is, so they look at the unemployment rate, right? So how many people in the labor force are employed versus unemployed? Well, what's interesting is that a big function of the reason that the unemployment rate was sub 4% going into this recession was because we actually had shrunk the labor force so much. The labor force participation rate, as you noted, didn't change, but yet population's been growing every year. So we grow our population roughly about 1.5% to 2% a year. So the population is growing, the working age population is growing, but yet the labor force participation rate wasn't changing. And, if you take a look at your prime age working group, your 25 to 54, yes, it did recover, but it only recovered about to half the level of what that participation was back in, prior 2008. So, we never, despite the fact that we had record low unemployment, the real unemployment rate in the economy was stubbornly high. And this was really part and parcel of what was leading to the complaints about wealth inequality and the wealth gap. And unfortunately, what will happen now because of what the Federal Reserve is doing, suppressing interest rates to zero, disincentivizing work, subsidizing failed businesses, these type of things, it's only going to exacerbate that wealth gap problem. So instead of it being the top, 1/10 of 1% that owns, 50% of the assets, it'll now be the top 0.005% of the 1% that, own 50% of the assets. And so the question simply becomes and to the point is that this is why we're seeing so many calls towards socialism. We're seeing people write articles saying, "Oh, well, the debt doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. We can just print money to pay it off, and as long as we just give money to households, everybody's fine." But that's not what that's not what Americans signed up for originally.
And that's also not how it works. Right. You can't just print money. You can't just borrow however much money without any consequences. There's a huge consequence, and that's stagnating economic growth. That's chronic unemployment, and it's the lack of productivity that this country has seen, and it's only going to be worse because the Fed, the Treasury, is making another huge bet, and they're paying everyone off so that the benefits are today. Mm-hmm. People are going to have more money than they would have had if this was a true disaster, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. But there's zero plan to pay it back. That's the problem. They come up with these elaborate plans to spray money out of the hose to everyone, but no plan on how to get that money back.
Right. Well, again, but this is kind of the attitude, right? And that has become the attitude in Washington, and it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. We've already talked about that, previously in the show, because the debt just increases every year. And, everybody talks good game about, being fiscally conservative and, we've got to find ways to pay for this thing or that thing, but we never actually do that. The debt keeps going up. And it's gotten so bad now that we just gave up even doing budgets. And we haven't run a budget in over a decade now. Right, so we don't even try to at least feign the idea of being fiscally conservative anymore and actually running a budget. We just keep passing continuing resolutions now. So at some point, it's going to lead to bigger problems, and you have two choices ultimately to fix your debt problem, which is you do it by choice or you do it by force. And that's what I want to talk about when we come back from the break here in just a second, is talking about the value of the dollar in particular. There's a lot of kind of belief right now that we can continue to issue debt and it's okay because we can always sell debt to somebody. But what happens if down the road somebody says, "Hey, you know what? I'm not really interested in buying your debt at 0.5% on your 10-year treasury. I want to be paid more for the risk I'm taking on your debt." So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about the value of the dollar and potentially what the risk is of a dollar shortage on a global basis to the U.S. economy and this potential recovery. Be right back after the break with Michael Lebowitz. Don't go away.
Should I stay or should I go? If you say that you are mine.
Got questions for Lance later? Ask now at realinvestmentadvice.com.